All righty. How many of y'all read Daniel before today? Chapter 1. Y'all studious people. That is how it should be. Let's go ahead and open up to Daniel, shall we? We're only doing the first chapter. And so we have quite a bit of time, and we're going to cover a little bit of the history of what is going on in Daniel. So, historical background. In 626 BC, the Babylonians declared independence from Assyria. All right, so this is a big deal. This is you might consider it akin to our Declaration of Independence here in the States. They are wanting to be separate and apart from Assyria. We'll talk a little bit later about how long they had been a vassal state of Assyria. But in 626, they declared independence, and in 612, the capital city of Nineveh fell. So Nineveh fell in 612, so 14 years after they declared independence, they were able to, at least in part, defeat Babylon. There were still remnants of Babylon left. In 609, Josiah, who is the last good king of Judah, he is killed. He is killed by the Egyptians at Megiddo, and Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, reigns for 3 months. And so he is over Judah for 3 months. He wasn't a great king, but he reigned for 3 months, and then Pharaoh Necho, who was the Pharaoh of Egypt, deposed him and said, yeah, you're not going to be king, and put in Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim served until 605. So 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt and Assyria at Carchemish. And so Assyria is fully gone now. Babylon is in, Nebuchadnezzar being by far the greatest king that the Babylonians had. And in the same year, 605, read 2 Kings 24:1, Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem and captured the city and took quite a few people. We read Daniel 1:1, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And so Jerusalem is under siege. Nebuchadnezzar is the one doing this. And Daniel and many other young men were taken into captivity in this year. It says, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. He brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility. All right, we'll get to more of that later. But this is why Daniel is in captivity, because he is either part of the royal family or he is nobility. One of the two. We don't know for sure which one, but that is why he is in Babylon. In 598 BC, Jehoiakim mysteriously died. There are no records as to why or what happened. And then Jehoiachin, or Jeconiah, depending on where you're reading it, what part of the text or what version, he ruled for 3 months, and then Nebuchadnezzar got rid of him. And then Nebuchadnezzar put in Zedekiah, and Zedekiah ruled for a long time until he eventually rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And in 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar said, yeah, I'm not having anybody rebel against me. And so he went to Jerusalem, and as we've just studied in Ezekiel, spent 2 years besieging the city, and in 586 BC, it fell. So there are certain dates that are very important in the history of Israel. And 586 is one of those dates. That is the fall of Judah. That is the end of the southern kingdom. That is the end of the nation of Israel as it was. 712 was the fall of the northern kingdom. And so there's about 140 years between the fall of the northern kingdom, which is about 10 tribes, to keep it very simple, and then the fall of the southern kingdom, Judah. And 586, Israel is no more. They are all in captivity. They are all scattered, just as the Lord promised they would be. That's a big deal. As you can imagine that all of these people who are scattered are terrified, concerned for their safety, concerned for their life. They're told they're going to either die by famine, by the sword, by something. They've heard it from all the prophets. Now it is coming true. Well, Nebuchadnezzar ruled the Babylonian Empire for about 40 years. He had a son named Amel-Marduk, and that translates to evil Merodach. This is not a good guy, right? His first name is evil. Not a good guy. And after Nebuchadnezzar passed in 562, Amel-Marduk ruled from 562 to 560. We're not going to go into the entire lineage of the Babylonian Empire. Suffice to say that after about 25 years, the Babylonian Empire was no more. Nebuchadnezzar was by far the greatest king. There were conspiracies. There was Neriglissar, his son, reigned after him. Neriglissar was there 556. His son reigned for about 9 months. Then his son was killed in a conspiracy by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, and this was Nabonidus, the last of the Neo-Babylonian kings, right? And so in 539, Babylon fell to the Persians. And all of this is important to the setting and the history of Daniel, because Daniel was still in Babylon when the Persians took over. And Daniel was actually a part of the government when the Persians were in charge. The Medes had earlier on helped the Babylonians destroy the Assyrians, and in 555 they were the ones destroying the Babylonians. And so there was a truce there early on, but it did not last. And in 539, Cyrus the Great surrounded Babylon, and it said that he actually took the city so easily, it was almost unopposed, because the Babylonians were more concerned with the revelry and having a good time than they were with defending the city. And so Cyrus and his men went into the, I don't know if the throne room is the right word, but at least into where all the ruling officials were, and I mean with almost no opposition, were able to destroy him. So the setting of the book occurs almost entirely in Babylon. The only verses that are not in Babylon are chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. Everything else, it happens in Babylon. That is where this takes place. Babylon descended from Babel. You'll know the Tower of Babel, correct? Well, Babylon descended from there. It's in Genesis 11, I believe. It is about 55 miles south of modern-day Baghdad. Babel, or at least that area, Babylon, has existed for many, many years. Hammurabi. You guys know the name Hammurabi? Yeah, the written code, right? The law. One of the most famous people to come from Babylon in 1792 to 1750 was his dynasty. Not only did he make the code of law that so many know, but he also began the building of the city of Babylon. And so the city of Babylon, the Babylonians have existed for a long time, but in the 7th through the 9th through the 7th century, they were actually a vassal state of Assyria. And we know the Assyrians had tons of power. Babylonians were a part of that. And then in the 7th century, Sennacherib ordered the city of Babylon to be destroyed. And the purpose of the city to be destroyed was so that it would not be remembered anymore. Right? So the Babylonians were going to be wiped off the face of the planet. They were not going to have anything else. But the successor of Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, I don't know if I'm saying these right, so if I'm not, and you know I'm not, just laugh and move on. He rebuilt the city, rescinded the order. He wanted the city to live. And Nabopolassar was the first king of Babylon after the defeat of Assyria. Herodotus claimed that the entire city of Babylon encompassed an area of almost 200 square miles. I'll keep reading what Herodotus said. Herodotus also said that the walls reached up 350 feet in the air with a base of 87 feet in width. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were present during this time. Nebuchadnezzar had them built for his queen Amytis to remind her of her Median homeland. The greenery, the trees, everything that was there, they were built specifically for his wife. There was a temple there to Marduk, or to Bel, which was a stepped tower or a ziggurat. It was one of the greatest structures of the city. A lot of what Herodotus claims is likely exaggeration. It is not likely that the city was 200 square miles itself, and it is also not likely that the walls reached 350 feet high. And so some of this we have to kind of take with a grain of salt, but the point being is that it was a great city. It was a fantastical city. I mean, it was impressive in all of its ways. Let's talk now about the dating of the book. How many of you have thought about or considered when Daniel was written? Most people don't really think too much about it. We had one hand go up that I saw. Maybe there were more. Daniel is, for us, we all believe that it is written by Daniel during the time of Daniel. I'll be up front. I agree with that. I absolutely think that's when it was written. But there are other views as to when the book of Daniel could be written. The early view is the time of Daniel. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The late view, though, the late view is during the time of the Maccabean revolt. How many of you have heard of that, the Maccabean revolt? A few of you. If you have not, research it. It's a really, really interesting time in history. The Maccabees were Jews who were alive during the time after Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was, as we are aware, ruler of just a fantastic empire, incredibly large in scope, had cities all over the world. I mean, it was just absolutely ginormous. And Alexander the Great, when he died, his empire was not able to be consolidated to one ruler. It had to be consolidated to two. There were two people that rose up to power after. And the Maccabees were fighting against the Seleucids, I think. Is that how you say it, Myron? Is that good? Seleucids? I said it right. Go me. Fighting against the Seleucids for about 7 years. They were fighting for their independence. They were fighting against the government they were in. And so the idea then is that the book of Daniel would have been written during this time. And it was written during this time as a way to encourage the Maccabees, as a way to encourage them that you can fight against the government you're in, you can win, you can be okay, you will be returned to your homeland. It would have been a very encouraging letter, an encouraging message to the people in that time period. And you might ask, well, what about the prophecies, Chris? Well, some of the prophecies are accounted for with the idea that it's prophecy after the fact. And so you would write it in such a way as to make it seem as if it was prophetic, but it really wasn't. It was just predicting what's already happened and making it seem like you were actually predicting it. But there are some problems. Because in the prophecies of Daniel, in the book of Daniel, there are prophecies relating to the Roman Empire, which came after Macedonians. And so it does not account for everything. It does not account for all of it. There's another really interesting thing, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls contained copies of the book of Daniel. If y'all aren't fully versed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't blame you, but very interesting to look at and to examine. There were thousands of copies, and most of the copies were actually in fragments. And in order to combine them and to make them work, you had to very carefully piece them together. And what's really interesting is today, the way that we would go about doing that is it would be in a very secure room. There would be no extra chemicals or no extra anything coming into it. You'd probably have to wear some gear. In the 70s, when they were putting all of these together, you'd have some people who were up there smoking next to all of these things and not paying any attention to the preservation of the documents, really. But Daniel was a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is a part of this enormous effort that we saw, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran, and Qumran was a community of Jewish people in about 160 to 79 AD, so 160 BC to about 79 AD, somewhere in that range, which is again after the Seleucid Empire. And Daniel was already a book there, which means that it was already seen as canon. It was a part of the Jewish canon at that point. There are, throughout the book of Daniel, a good portion of it is written in Aramaic. Myron is going to be talking about all the Aramaic portions, so expect him to know Aramaic by the end of the next 2 weeks, right? Just like Arabic. He'll be fluent. Language experts verify that the Aramaic that was used in Daniel is comparable to that of other writings found from the 5th century BC, and it is quite different from the 1st and 2nd. And so when you look at the dating of the book of Daniel, you may never hear again that there are different potential dates, and you may hear again that there are different potential dates, but if ever you do, just know there's a lot of issues with the late dating of Daniel. There are a lot of issues with the late dating of Daniel. Daniel was written by Daniel during the time of Daniel's life. There is no doubt in my mind about that. The book is 2 parts. It is part historical narrative, as we're going to go over a little bit of it today, and it is also part apocalyptic writing, as we will go over maybe not next week, but the following week and the last week. All right, we're about to jump into the text. We've got plenty of time, which is good. That's a first. I am excited about that. So who were Daniel? Who was Shadrach? Who was Meshach? And who was Abednego? Well, let's go ahead and read through chapter 1. We'll start in verse 1. We're just going to make our way all the way through, and then we will discuss as we go along. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. And then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see." So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. All right. So what were the requirements of Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael, and Azariah? Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, they needed to be from the royal family or the nobility. That was an absolute requirement. That was what Nebuchadnezzar said. You are to bring them back. They are to be high in ranking. And part of this was a show of power on the Babylonian side, right? If your servants are the nobility of other nations, that's a show of power. It's to say, we've conquered these nations, they're servants to us. They may have been noble somewhere. They may have been royal somewhere, but here, they wait on us hand and foot. Not only that, they were to be youths without blemish. Likely 15, 16 years old, maybe up to 20-something, but they were young. They weren't children, they were youths. And without blemish, of good appearance. These were to be handsome and beautiful individuals. Not someone that we don't want to look at, but rather someone that we do want to look at. That's what the king wanted. King wanted to have around him, surrounding him, intelligent, attractive people so that he would seem better. So Daniel was of the royal family. He was noble. He was a youth without blemish. He was good looking. Then it says, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. So not only do they need to be intelligent, but they also need to be able to learn quickly. They need to be skillful in the application of that understanding, wisdom, and they need to be competent. Competent to stand in the king's palace, to do the things that the king wants them to do. They're looking for the best of the best. This is not a small job. This is not a small requirement. This is it's a very difficult thing to fit into this category. You see that the king is narrowing down who he wants. Nobility, good appearance, intelligent. Consistently narrowing down who he wants because Nebuchadnezzar wants the best of the best in his palace. And what were they going to do there? They were going to learn about the Chaldeans. They were going to spend 3 years learning about the Babylonians. Now, the Babylonians had a very advanced, education system. They were able to teach very effectively. And the reason for their teaching, because they had people coming in from different nations and all sorts of places, the reason for their education was not just to make them smarter, but rather to make them forget where they came from and integrate into the society that they are in. I think you guys may recall a couple of weeks ago as I was talking about Ezekiel, it was believed that whatever nation conquered another nation, those gods were greater than the gods of the conquering nation. That was the belief back then, right? Is if our nation conquered you, that means our gods are better, our gods are stronger, our gods are wiser, whatever the case may be. And so you go to Babylon in these ancient Near Eastern times, and you realize that Babylon has conquered my nation. Well, their gods must be the true gods. Their gods must be the gods I want to serve. And so for 3 years, they are then taught about these gods, Marduk, Bel being one of them, the primary god of the Babylonians. So for 3 years, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are taught about this. And again, this starts in about 605 BC. We'll talk about it a little bit later. The vessels that Nebuchadnezzar brought are important. They do have import. It was part of the worship and the rituals that the Israelites partook in, and they were taken back to Babylon. And eventually they are used improperly, which is a big issue for the nation. In Deuteronomy 28, 16 through 44, it mentions that if the Israelites do not do what the Lord has commanded, that there will be a curse come upon you and overtake you. And so the Israelites have been told over and over, if you do not do what you are supposed to do in serving the Lord, you will be lost. You will leave your nation. You will be taken. Deuteronomy 28, 49 through 52, there's another prophecy regarding that another nation will come down and besiege the Israelites. And again, we see that has happened. Isaiah 39:6 specifically states that Babylon would be the one to carry all things to their own nation. So we know who it is. It's been proven that's who it was. And in verse 2, we see that Jehoiakim gave Judah into his hand. So why did God allow for all of this to happen? Why did God allow for these 4 men, among others, to be taken? Why did God allow for Israel to be besieged? Punishment. Punishment to destroy or punishment to teach? It's punishment to teach. God wanted to teach the Israelites a lesson because they weren't listening any other way. You recall what Ezekiel did, right? I mean, the lengths that man went to, laying on his side for 390 days and then switching for 40 days. His wife died. He wasn't even allowed to mourn. People weren't listening. They weren't taking heed to what was happening. And so God said, all right, you're not going to listen to my prophets. Looks like you're not going to listen without some force. They needed to learn a lesson. One thing I want us to learn, to at least take away from this, we as Americans consider that we have, and some people may disagree with this statement, and that's okay, but we have grown up in a land that was founded upon biblical principles. Whether you believe it was a Christian nation at the beginning or not, that's fine. It was founded on Christian principles. I think of that we can all agree. And today we look around in our society, and what do we see? Do we see Christian principles? Or do we see people actively flaunting and kicking against the goads? Do we see people actively sinning and reveling in that sin? There are apps on our phone that we can download. You could all download it right now if you wanted. Some of you may have it. TikTok, Instagram, these things being the most egregious of them, I think. And you can look at some of these videos that are just actively encouraging sinful behavior. We consider our nation today and we wonder what happened. How did we get here? We got here because people aren't listening to God's message. And part of that, if they don't hear it, they can't listen to it. So we do have a responsibility to be like Ezekiel and to go out and teach. But not everybody's going to listen to the message of God. The four men that we're going to be studying mostly about in this book lived in a time and lived in a nation where people did not listen to the word of God. How did that affect their faith? How did that affect what they did? How did that affect their actions? Did the people around them influence them to the point where they forsook God? Or were they firm in their faith because it was their faith and because they knew who their God is? We cannot allow what happens outside of our Christian family here to take away from the necessity of worshiping and serving our God. There will be people that sin out there. It is our responsibility, we'll talk about this morning as well, here in just a little bit, who have been part of the church, who have gone astray. There are people who have never been part of the church and are still astray. It is our responsibility to talk to them about Jesus. It is our responsibility to stand firm in our faith, to be watchful of what we do. James talks about that. It is not our responsibility to make sure that they are doing what they ought to do. The soul that sins shall die. We are each responsible for our own lives, for our own actions, for our own souls. But we have a responsibility to talk to people about God and to stand firm in the truth. And that is exactly what Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They were to learn the language of the Chaldeans and the history of the Chaldeans. It is very possible that a good portion of this was Aramaic, or as we know it, Arabic now. But it's likely that they were also having to learn Akkadian. Akkadian was a language back then that was, I guess you could have it similar to Egyptian in some way. It had a cuneiform script. It was not easy to learn. Very, very difficult language to learn. And a lot of the Babylonians' important texts were in Akkadian. The Aramaic language would not have been too much of a stretch. The alphabet was similar to the Hebrew alphabet. But let's talk about the diet here. Let's talk about the diet of these men. Actually, we'll talk about what that slide says, and then we'll talk about the diet. The names. If you pay attention very closely to the names, the four names, you have Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And Elohim is the name for God, and Yahweh is the name of the personal name of God. And if you take the first 2 to 3 letters, Elohim, El, and if you take Yah of Yahweh, and you add it, and you see at the end of their names, these are men who are named for the Father. Daniel, or Dan-E-L, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah. These names are very important. Daniel means God is my judge. Yahweh, Elohim, is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Mishael, I like this one. Who is what God is? Who is what God is? Who can compare to God? And then Azariah, Yahweh has helped. But then their names were changed. Their names were changed. Why were their names changed? Again, to eradicate what they were and to cement in them where they are. They're now part of the Babylonian nation. The gods you served before are of no importance. Now you serve new gods, and so Belteshazzar means Bel, protect his life. Bel, protect his life. Shadrach means the command of Aku. Command of Aku. Meshach, who is what Aku is? And Abednego means a servant of Nebo. So their names were changed for a reason. And here we see that does not affect what they do. I'll leave this up here for a second as I talk about the next little bit. They had resolved that they were not going to defile themselves, Daniel specifically, they were not going to defile themselves with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, we don't know exactly why. We don't know exactly why. We do know that he wanted to eat only vegetables, and he did not want to drink the wine. It's possible that the food itself was unkosher. It was unclean. Maybe there were something with cloven feet, something that was already dead. It was unkosher for a certain reason. Maybe it was that it was cooked in a way or prepared in a way that made it unkosher. It's possible that this was offered to their gods as a sacrifice, and so it was unclean in that regard. The food and wine would have been dedicated to different deities. Another option is that by eating a meal that was given by the king, you are declaring fellowship and you are entering into a covenant relationship with them. So there are many options as to why they did not want to partake of the food and the wine, but they didn't talk about any of those, did they? They simply said, we don't want to defile ourselves. And they went to the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs, it says, has compassion and favor from God. But then he doesn't do anything. What I believe that favor and compassion allowed was for the chief eunuch to assign a steward who would have been compassionate to them, to listen to what they said, because right after this, it says Daniel went to the steward who was over them and said, test your servant for 10 days. So here we have the scientific method. There's a hypothesis that if we do this, we're going to be here. This will be the result, right? And so then the experiment is the 10-day test, and the end of the 10 days is the analyzing of the data. And we see at the end of the 10 days that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it says, are fatter than all of the other people. Now, if I were the steward in Babylonian captivity and my head was on the line, those boys better look way better than everybody else. Because if it's a negligible difference, you're eating the king's food. I don't care. I'm not risking my head for you to be just slightly better. That might just be genetics, right? No, you better look way better. And so God, it does not say that God provided them blessings through it, but any other option seems unbelievably, egregiously wrong. God blessed them in what they did. God provided for them the nutrients, the things that they needed in order to survive and more than that, to thrive. We don't have much time left. In fact, we have about 2 minutes left. The last few verses here, I want us to hone in on who specifically gave them the wisdom and the learning. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. These men were given the blessings that they had by God. This was not of their own accord. It was not of their own doing. It was by God. And because God had blessed them at the end of their days, the end of the 3 years, and there is some difficulty with the 3 years there, but the end of those 3 years is what it says in chapter 1. That's what we're going with right now. They were said to be 10 times better. 10 times better than everybody else. Now, while that is certainly a literary exaggeration, the point stands that they were a step above everybody else. These 4 men were more highly valued than everybody else in the kingdom. Why? Because they served their God. Because they were not willing to go against and to go with the culture of what was normal and acceptable. Can you imagine eating a king's feast? Man, that sounds wonderful, doesn't it? They said, no, give me vegetables. I want some of those cucumbers. Some tomatoes, maybe. I don't know. Some people think that's a fruit. I don't know what they are. We have to be like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, willing to stand up for the truth no matter what culture says, no matter what the consequences may be. You realize what the consequences might have been if they were not fatter and more plump and more healthy looking? It's very possible that their lives would forfeit. Nebuchadnezzar was not known for his soundness of mind and being kind and gracious. We must be like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Next week, 2 through 4, 5? 2 through something. 2 through 4. So read 2 through 4. Be ready to interrupt Brother Goins. All right. Just kidding. That is all. Thank you.